All right, well, on today's episode, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to take another semi-break from our study of the book of Galatians. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a sermon with you that I preached back in, I think it's about, I would say, fall of 2021. No, further than that, actually, come to think of it. 2019, I think, is the year that I preached this message. And the reason why I'm doing this, and again, why I'm calling it a semi-break, is because we're not going to be looking specifically at a passage in the text of Galatians, but this sermon, I think, is going to lay forth some things that are related to things that we've been talking about in Galatians, specifically what we talked about last time when we started talking about walking by the Spirit. And after I got done with that episode, I thought, you know what? I think I preached a sermon on the presence and the glory of God and what that does for our transformation and everything like that. And so I thought, well, to kind of make the point further, I think I'll share that episode next time, just so we all can come to a deeper understanding of what we're talking about and what we talked about last time as it relates to walking in the Spirit. At the last part of last episode, we were talking about. I shared with you some things from Second Corinthians chapter 3, and I mentioned that in this episode. It's not a main feature. In fact, I probably only talk about it within the last 10 minutes of the message, but the whole message itself, I'm drawing from certain passages in Exodus 33 and 34, talking about Moses and his longing for the presence of God and the glory of God, and how that works towards what that says about transformation, God's transformation in people's lives. And, that kind of goes into some of the things that we were talking about last time. And even in this message and just some of the passages that we explore, we see Moses is longing for what he's asking for to also for the Israelite community to have as well, which I think kind of speaks along the lines of the whole thing of loving your neighbor. And again, if you're familiar with a lot of things that we've been talking about in Galatians, love is the driving force. And even Paul says that, to fulfill the law, you should love your neighbor as yourself. That's what the commandment says. So there's just certain things that are woven in there that I think furthers what we've been talking about from last episode. So I want to go ahead and do that and share that with you on this episode. So that's the agenda. Now, a couple of things that I want to lay out to you before we get into this here is one, there's an audio issue on this audio file that I can't change, that I can't get rid of, and I apologize for that. I don't know exactly what happened or what went wrong or why it's going about in this way, but you're going to hear a low volume yet somewhat high pitched buzz throughout the message, and I hope that that's not too annoying or too disturbing that takes your attention away from the sermon itself. I think and I hope that what is laid out in the message and the volume of the actual audio in the sermon kind of outdoes the low buzzing noise that you hear on the file there. But I've tried to get rid of that, and I haven't been able to. So for that, I apologize. But just so you know that it's something on my end, not anything on your end. So hopefully that doesn't serve as too much of a distraction. Secondly, you're gonna hear some like metal clanging in the background, and you've actually might have heard this from time to time in other episodes where I share a sermon. I'm not entirely sure, but you hear that clanging because it comes from metal flaps that are on the roof of the place where we meet. And if it's particularly windy outside that day, they'll make a lot of noise, and it was somewhat windy that day. So if you hear a metal clanging sound, it's not a loud sound, but it's hard to miss. Then that's what that is. And again, I apologize for that as well. That's something that is beyond my control as well. But other than that, you should be able to hear the message itself just fine. I just wanted to make you aware of those potential distractions in the audio file. So we will go ahead and transition you into the sermon. But before we do that, just want to remind you that if you enjoy loving the scriptures and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts, also on iHeartRadio, YouTube, or Spotify. You can also follow me, Steve Gill, on Twitter. The handle is at LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures, and also my other account at LTScriptsPod. That's LTSCRIPTSPOD. And also, don't forget to order a copy of my book, Signs of the End: What Did Jesus Say About His Own Return and the Events That Point to It? A book about Jesus' words to his disciples in the Olivet Discourse, Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21. A great book and a great resource if you enjoy the topic of eschatology and the second coming and all those sorts of things. I would really encourage you to purchase it. Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com are a couple places where you can get a copy of that. I hope you read it, and I hope you're blessed by it. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it. So without further ado, I will transition you into the sermon. We'll go ahead and have this as our episode. There won't be any post-sermon commentary. Next episode, we'll go back into the text of Galatians chapter 5, and we'll pick up where we left off, where we'll be talking about the distinction between works of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. So it should be a good topic when that comes around. Good topic with what we talk about here in the sermon, so I hope it's profitable for you. I hope it blesses you. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures.
I've had a little bit of a struggle this week, just as far as it relates to preparing for what I'm going to share and what I'm going to speak on, because the reality is that I only have one Sunday, okay, and so in looking at the passages and everything that I want to go over, I'm like, how am I going to fit all of this that I want to talk on in a reasonable amount of time? And so, mentally and emotionally, I'm just going crazy because I'm like, I want to talk about all of this stuff. I want to take things here and this passage here. I want to talk about all of it, but how am I going to get it into a reasonable amount of time? And then I kind of came to a point, and I think the Lord kind of had something to do with this, just kind of speaking with me and just kind of thinking, you know what? If you have to leave some things off, that's okay. If there's anything within that I have to drop off that any of you need to know, I have confidence that the Lord in some way, shape, or form will bring that to your attention in whatever way, I don't know. So in a certain sense, that's given me a little bit of peace. It has created a little bit of a challenge as far as organizing my thoughts, because now that I'm not going to be sharing everything that I wanted to share, I'm like, okay, how do I arrange all of this here? So your prayers would be very much appreciated as I roll out what I'm going to talk about here. But I want to take a look a little bit at Moses this morning. And Moses is a guy that over the past few weeks has just been somebody who's really fascinated me, both personally, just in my own personal reading of Scripture, and just the time that I've had to read through Exodus and parts of the Old Testament, and also related to just kind of some personal study, some extra study that I've done as it relates to my podcast. I've had a couple of episodes that are dedicated to God's encounter with Moses' encounter with God at the burning bush. And in all of that, I've just noticed some things that have just been really fascinating. One of the things that's really been fascinating for me is just seeing how Moses' outlook on things, his situation as it relates to leading the people out of Egypt, his relationship with God, how all of those things have evolved, and just how you kind of see this change in Moses as he goes from this shepherd who's overlooking his father-in-law's flock to the leader of the people of Israel, and just how how his relationship with God grows in response to all of that. And there's a certain portion of Scripture I've really been looking at and just kind of really been mulling over, and that's in Exodus chapter 33. So you have a Bible, go ahead and turn there. I think it will be a little bit helpful just to kind of do a quick overview of just kind of how we get to this point. Exodus chapter 33, we are well into the Exodus, just kind of after Moses has led the people out of Egypt. And it's been very interesting, just when you kind of think about Moses' beginning, when God first appears to him. As an 80-year-old man, by the way, I mean, I don't know if many people realize that, but Moses was up there in age when God appeared to him in the burning bush. And if you're familiar with Scripture, you know the story, how Moses is out there, he's tending the sheep of his father-in-law. He sees a bush that's burning, but it's not consumed. He goes over to check it out, and God calls out to him from the bush, and they have a good conversation about God's purpose for him in going to Pharaoh and telling Pharaoh to let the people go. And it's a very interesting exchange because Moses is one who realizes that he doesn't have any sort of impressive credentials behind his name to go up to the king of Egypt, Pharaoh himself, and say, this is what the Lord says. We're to take a 3-day journey into the wilderness so that we may worship the Lord. He says, I'm not that kind of guy. And if you read the exchange in chapters 3 and 4, you see that Moses tries his best to convince God that he's not the person for the job. It's just interesting, some of the excuses that he uses. But what's interesting to me at the end of that exchange, you come to the realization is that, God is relentless in what he has for Moses. He's not letting go. God is saying that, Moses, you are the man that I've chose to do this. And realize that God didn't choose Moses because God needed him. It wasn't as if God was doing this and kept his eyes on Moses and insisting on Moses be the person to do this because God was thinking, if there's anybody who is able to pull this off, it's Moses. Moses, I need you. I need you. I need you. I need you. So please, please, please get up from where you are, go to Egypt and fulfill this task that I've given you. That's not the case at all. I really believe that what you have there, what you're dealing with is a God who has a very specific, very special plan for Moses. And part of that is just really giving Moses an exposure, I believe, to himself. I mean, yes, he has this big task of leading the people out of Egypt. Yes, he has this big task of overseeing things just as it relates to this large community of people that he's leading out. But I think along the way, God has a purpose in the sense that he just wants to reveal himself and expose himself to Moses in a very personal way. And I think that purpose catches on to it with Moses, and you kind of see that change that goes on when you get up to this chapter in chapter 33. And so the mindset of Moses, just as you read in that area of Scripture, at least to me, is very amazing. I'm going to point some things out, so make some observations here as we look at this. But in the immediate context of what we're dealing with here, if you were to read the chapter previous to chapter 33, chapter 32, you come to the familiar story of the golden calf. And so, again, if we're familiar with the story, we understand that Moses has been up on the wilderness for a long time, and the people start to wonder where Moses went. And so they approach Aaron and they say, make us gods, because we don't know what happened to this Moses. He went up on the mountain and he hasn't come back. We don't know what's happened to him. And so Aaron instructs them to take all their gold jewelry and everything off, and he shapes this calf. And so from that point on, it's just chaos in the camp. They're worshiping this god, and they get up to engage in to play, is what my translation says. I think that's my translation. Some translation says to play. And the idea behind it is that they added elements of sensuality to the celebration that they were doing. So when you read further in the text, it says that Aaron let everything just go out of control. Now keep in mind that we're dealing with a people. You're familiar with the layout of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 20, you have the layout of the Ten Commandments. And understand that when the Ten Commandments were given, that was given with the voice of God booming out from the mountain, so everybody can hear it. Everybody can hear him speaking these words, to the point that they were really afraid and said, we can't stand the sound of the voice of God anymore. If we hear it one more time, we're going to die. But here's the point. They understand, they've heard what God has had to say. And so they're very much familiar now, because they've been told about the whole thing of idols and not bowing down to them and everything like that. So it didn't take long for them to stray away from what God had told them. Now, meanwhile, Moses is up on the mountain, and God's like, "Oh, Moses, go down to your people there. They've done a really bad, terrible thing. They're bowing down to this calf." And pretty much he says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to wipe them out, and I'm going to make a name for you. And so Moses intercedes for them, intercedes with God for them, and says that, remember the promise that you made to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And so God relents from what he was going to do. Moses, again, interceding for the community. And so just in light of all of that's happened, when you get to this chapter in chapter 33, just keep in mind that whole thing has happened, okay? And in the aftermath of that, even if you look at the beginning part of chapter 33, if you hear the words of the Lord here in the beginning of that chapter, it says, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt, to the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying to your offspring, I will give it. I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people.'" And that whole adjective of stiff-necked is something that you see sprinkled throughout books like Exodus and Deuteronomy and stuff. It's a very accurate description. It's just another way of talking about the stubbornness of the people of Israel and the continued rebellion against the Lord. And so the Lord lays it out there, says, this is a stiff-necked people. And he says, I'm not going to go up among you, because if I go up among you and you guys mess up, it's going to be lights out for all of you. That's pretty much what he's saying. And so that the people hear that, they, as it says there in verse 4 and following, they heard these disastrous words, and it really hits them to the core. Now, when you get to verse 7, and again, this is all set up for what I want to see here later on in the middle of chapter 33. It's interesting that Moses inserts this section about how Moses meets up with the Lord at the tent of meeting. So I want to read verses 7 through 11 here, because it gives us a little bit of an understanding of what's going on just as far as Moses' relationship to God himself. So in verse 7 of chapter 33, it says, "Now Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, far off from the camp, and he called it the tent of meeting. And everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people would rise up, and each would stand in his tent door and watch Moses until he had gone into the tent. When Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. And when all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise up and worship, each at his tent door. Thus the Lord," now listen to this, verse 11, "Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. When Moses turned again into the camp, his assistant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent." And focus your attention, again, I just made the emphasis there at the beginning of verse 11, where it says, Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. So that's kind of the context, the contextual situation that you have there, just this description of the kind of relationship that God and Moses had. It was something that was very close, and it was something that was very deep. And the Lord willingly came down and spoke with Moses in this manner. And so when you get into verses 12 and following, and here's where we really want to pick some things apart. I think really what you're dealing with here is one of these tent meetings, if you want to call it that, between Moses and God. Because here you have Moses in this intimate moment with God. Now remember what God has just said, not only to Moses but to everybody else in the community. He says that I am not going to go up among you. Okay, I'm not going to go up among you. So with that in mind, and Moses having this interaction with God, notice what we start to see in verse 12. In verse 12, it says, Moses said to the Lord, "See, you say to me, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send up with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. And what's he saying here? This whole thing of, he says, Moses said, okay, so you've given me this command, bring up this people. And notice what he said, he said, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Now, I think at first glance, when I look at this, somebody might think, okay, Moses has been told, I'm not going up among you, lest I consume all of you and you all die. And so at first glance, and I've thought this for a while, and again, this draws out the importance of context in what you're looking at here. One of the things that I had thought is that, okay, Moses is recognizing the fact that he can't accomplish this mission by himself or on his own strength. And this is Moses' way of saying, God, I need you. You're telling me to bring up this people. You're telling me to bring these people out, to lead these people, but you're not going to come with us, so how am I supposed to accomplish this by myself? I can't do it by myself. I need your help. I need your guidance. I need your strength. Now, of course, all of that is true. Moses does need God's leadership, his strength, his guidance, and everything like that. But again, just remember what I just pointed out to you before in the previous section of this chapter. Remember what God was saying at the beginning of chapter 33. He said again, "Depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt, into the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your offspring I will give it." Now in verse 2, he says, "I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, and all those other ites that are in there." So really, God is laying out this whole thing where he's saying, look, the mission is still going to be successful. The angel is going to go before you, and God's still going to be involved. He says, I will drive out the ites. I will do that. So God is not totally hands off, but God is just saying, I'm just not going to be with you. So when I look at this here, and Moses saying, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. I think Moses recognizes, he's like, I'm coming to this realization that we're going to be without you. We're going to be without your presence. It's not a matter of how are you going to help us because we need your help. God says he will. I will drive it out. It's just going to be from a distance, and you get the impression that's what God is saying. And so Moses is like, I don't think I'm okay with that. Yes, the mission is going to be successful, but how am I going to live without your presence? I think that if we wanted to put it in a simple question form, I think that might be what's going through Moses' mind. How can I go on without your presence? And I just think that that's amazing because Moses didn't see this whole trek, going up to Mount Sinai and then however distance that they had to get to the promised land. This wasn't a situation where God was a means to an end. Now, God did say, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to help you and everything like that. But for Moses now, and again, this is all part of the development of Moses that I've seen as you look at his story, it's more than a matter of acquiring the land. It's more than a matter of being rescued out of Egypt, the land of slavery. It's more than that. Those are great things, but Moses is just saying, God, I want you. I want you. And I think that's a wonderful, wonderful perspective to have. And you can tell that he has this whole thing of intimate relationship in mind. He says, still there in the middle of verse 12, he says, yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. So he's saying like, let's take those two elements there of what he says about knowing you by name and then finding favor in your sight. If you just consider at first what he's talking about where he says that you have also found favor in my sight. I mean, Moses understands, and this is something that God has told him, that says, I favor you. I really do favor you. Now, this is something that Moses has heard from God before, but yet God is saying, I'm not going to go up among you. Moses is saying, wait a minute here. Wait, how does that work? You have favor with me, plus you say, I know you by name. Now notice he doesn't say, I know your name, although God does know Moses' name. God knows everybody's name. But the idea of being known by name speaks of something that there's a closeness there. Man, it is windy outside. where, being known by name, it speaks of something that is a little bit more close, a little bit more intimate. There's a difference between knowing somebody's name and being known by your name. And so Moses is remembering just some of these interactions and what God has said and saying, look, you say that I found favor in your eyes, plus you said that you know me by name, but you're not coming up with us. I don't think that that's going to be something that's okay. I want to be somebody who is continually in your presence. In other words, I guess one thing that you can say is Moses was not a very big fan of a long-distance relationship with God. He wasn't very much a fan of a long-distance relationship with God. And, this is just something that has just really spoken to me in a very profound way. Because the one thing that I think that we can do sometimes, when it comes to our relationship with God, here's the question that we can ask ourselves. Do we treat our relationship with God in a way that our relationship with him is good as long as he continues to be a means to our ends? Maybe not necessarily even to his ends, but to our ends. We have a lot of wants, we have a lot of desires of this life. I think a lot of us have desires for ourselves, live in a good house, have a good job, those sorts of things. All the things that we attribute to regular society. And a lot of us may look to God for those things and say, God, please provide this, please provide that, and those sorts of things. And as long as he does those things for us, that's really great and wonderful and grand. If things don't roll out the way that we want them to, we might scratch our head and say, God, what in the world is going on? This is what I wanted here. I wanted my kid to go to this college. I wanted to get this house here, but it's not working out for me. I thought you said that you'd be with me, and we start to kind of grumble against God. We kind of start to sound like the Israelites in some sense, actually, sometimes. And so we think that way. And do we ever say to God, or think in our hearts, or pray to God, and say that, Lord, no matter what happens, no matter what course I end up taking in life, no matter what situation comes before me, you are enough. And I just want you. I just want you. Whether I get what I want or not, I just want you. And if I do get what I want it with you, not without you. See, here's the thing. Sometimes we might want certain things, and then if we get those certain things, there's a temptation of leaving God behind. That's something that God had to warn Moses about and the rest of the Israelite community for when they actually got into the promised land. He says, look, you're going to be going into a very fertile land. It's a good land, a good, spacious land. And you're going to be cultivating crops from crops that you didn't plant and living in houses that you didn't build and all these things. But he said, make sure that when you're in the midst of all of that, that you do not forget the Lord. But I think that if you're at a spot where you're like, Lord, I just want you, and whatever blessings that you bestow on us is good and great, but I want those things with you, I think that we're in a very good spot. And so I think that's where Moses was, and we're dealing with something in a situation where we're talking about leading the people into a land. We're talking about something that God has actually promised him, as opposed to the examples that I used before, where a lot of the things that we want and we want God to help us with and provide us with aren't necessarily guaranteed, and aren't things that God actually promised that he would give us, right? And then when we don't get those things, we're like, God, what's up? Instead of, that's okay, God, you're enough. Whether I have those things or I don't have those things, as long as I have you, I'm in a good spot. So even with the guarantee of success that this whole thing is going to work out the way that God said it was going to do. They're going to take possession of the land. They're going to defeat their enemies. Moses is like, that's great, but I don't want to do it without you, because I think Moses has started to cling to the Lord in very deep, very personal relationship. And again, you see the manifestation of that, of just how they communicate with one another, just in that section that I read to you before. So that's kind of what you see going on there with Moses. And so when you go into verse 13, back to Exodus chapter 33, in verse 13, he says, "Now therefore, if I have found favor in your sight," in other words, he's saying, since this is the case, since you have said, I know you by name and you have found favor in my sight, since that is the case, now therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, please show me your ways, that I may know you in order to find favor in your sight. So that's what he says there. He says, please show me your ways. Another way you can say, teach me your ways, or however way that you want to look at that. But I think that there's a couple of elements that go into this whole thing here of show me your ways. And in a lot of cases, in some sense, that Moses has already been exposed to these ways that he's wanting God to reveal to him. In a verbal way, just as far as what the Lord has laid out and commanded for Moses and the rest of the community to do, that's an indication of the Lord's ways. He says, show me your ways. Well, those are part of the ways. Moses has spent a great deal of time with God already, explaining and expounding to Moses just kind of how this whole thing with the law is going to work. How things are going to be with your relationships with one another, making restitution with one another, all these things. And so that's part of the whole thing of God showing Moses his ways, but it's not simply just a matter of, God, please show me what the rules are. I think in Moses' heart and Moses' mind, it's a little bit deeper than that. It's not so much a matter of, show me the rules of life, show me the rules of conduct, so we know what to do, and so we can just follow those rules the way that you've shown us to. It goes deeper than that, I think, because I think whenever it comes to the ways that are laid out, and just use the word Scripture, the way that Scripture reveals what we are to do, how we are to live, how are we to interact with one another, those things that are revealed to us that God says this is what you are to do is a reflection on who He is. It gives us a little bit of an understanding of what God is like. And so within that whole thing of these are the ways that I laid out before you, I think in that you get a sense of who God is just based on what God tells you to do. That's part of it. I think another part of what Moses is talking about as far as show me your ways is that it's kind of like Moses is telling God, I want to continue to be with you so that I can see how you work. So in a command sense and also in an observational sense, I think what Moses is getting to is that I want you to continue to show me who you are. And that's what he means by I want to know your ways. I want to know more about you. I want to know how you tick. One thing that's important for us to keep in mind is that there isn't really a written canon of Scripture at this point. There isn't anything there. It's not like Moses can turn to Nehemiah or can turn to Matthew or anything like that. There's not anything like that in existence right now. And so in combination to what God is telling Moses as far as his commandments and the stipulations, the statutes, and all those things, you also have, in combination to that, just the Lord at work in their midst. In a lot of ways to kind of validate the things that God has laid forth and what he has verbally commanded. So you have all those things working together, and you have this display for Moses of just how God works, how God ticks, how he moves, how he interacts with his people. What are the things that he likes? What are the things that he doesn't like? Lord, who are you? That's the whole thing. And so when he says there, he says, I want this to be the case. He says, I want you to show me your ways. The reason there, it's still in the middle of verse 13, it says, that I may know you. In other words, he's saying that so that I can know who you are, so I can grow in personal relationship with you, in order to find favor in your sight. Now, again, this is just another, this is kind of repetitive in some sense. It talks about God having told Moses that you've already found favor in my sight, and now Moses wants all of this to go on so that in order to find favor in your sight. And I don't think that's Moses communicating to God that I'm just have a fear of like losing favor with you, and so I have to regain favor again. That's not what we're dealing with, but I think Moses is just saying, again, I just want this whole relationship that we have, I want this to be ongoing. I know this is what I have right now, but I want it to be ongoing. I want it to continue. I want to be in your presence, and I want to grow in the knowledge of you. I want to see you at work. I want to know what makes you you. I just want to know about you. I want to know about you just like you know me. I want to know you like you know me, and I think that's what Moses is expressing there. And the question I'll just lay out just before we proceed any further, is that our heart cry? There's a lot of things that we desire in this life, and we will do whatever it takes for us to, in order for us to receive those things. But in all the desires and all the wants, in all those desires that we have, is anywhere in those desires this whole desire of, Lord, I want to be in your presence, and I want to continue to know you, and I want to grow in that intimacy with you. It's a challenging question because I think sometimes there are a lot of things, especially in our day and age and in this culture, that serve as distractions for that goal to be met, to a point that maybe sometimes we don't even think along those lines. I know that sometimes I had to be very careful of that as well. But here's the interesting thing about Moses. We're gonna take things a step further here. What I've just shown you in those two instances are things having to do with Moses himself and with God. What God feels, how God feels, what God thinks about this relationship that he has with God. And having this understanding of, I am not going to be okay if you're not in my life. Win, lose, or draw, just with whatever happens with the land, okay, you're going to give me the land, you're going to give us the land, everything's going to work out, you said so. But if you're not going to be there, that's not okay with me. I want you to be with me. But he doesn't leave it at just himself. And this is amazing considering just what happened, what I just laid out for you, what happened in chapter 32 with the golden calf and everything like that, and everybody going crazy and wild all over the place. You notice what he says there at the end of that verse 13. He says, consider too that this nation is your people. And why does he say that? And what exactly is he getting to when he says that? Consider too that this nation is your people. And I think that that's Moses' very simple way of just interceding for the people in the community as well, and saying, what I want for myself, just as it relates to my relationship with you, I want for the community as well. This isn't just something for me where I just want this for myself, but you know what? I want it for everybody else as well. And with the display of what happened in chapter 32, you might think that they really do need to grow in their knowledge and relationship with God. And which would lead Moses all the more, make all the sense the more of what Moses had interceded for them in chapter 32 when God said, I want to wipe them out. Moses says, I don't want you to do that. Remember the promises that you had with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But I think on the other hand here, and what we see here in chapter 33, is that not only does he want those people to be spared, but he wants them to be spared, and he wants them to have that same close, intimate relationship. He wants them to know God on the same level. And what's amazing about that to me is that just the other-centeredness of Moses as he's having this interaction with God. Let me ask this question about ourselves. Think about this for a little bit. When it comes to our thoughts, our desires about other people or for other people, does it ever involve us having a strong desire that people grow in intimate relationship with their Lord? I think we have desires for other people in the sense that, okay, I hope that this part of their life goes well. I hope that they're able to do this. I hope they're able to do that. We might share prayer requests. I have this going on. I have this. I want this. And we say, yeah, okay, this is something that I want for you too. It would be good if this happened for you in your life. But I wonder, how often does it cross our minds that when it comes to what we want and what we desire for other people, that we really want to the deepest core of ourselves to have other people experience the close, intimate relationship with God that we might have? And listen, I'm not just talking about this in the sense of viewing people on the outside looking in, people who aren't Christians, and saying, I want them to come to know the Lord so that they can come into a relationship. That is important, but I'm not even talking about that. I'm even expanding on that and just saying, how often do we think about that about one another? Do we pray and have this longing desire that I want my Christian brothers and sisters, I want the men and women of Community Harvest Church to have that deep, personal, intimate relationship, and to have it on that level where if God were to say, hypothetically, we know that God isn't going to leave, but if he were hypothetically to say, I'm leaving, we would say, that is not good. my life will not be okay without you. I want to be in your presence. I long for your presence. I long for you. I just want you. Is that something that we desire for other people? Moses had this, and it's just a simple phrase where he just says, consider too that this nation is your people. It's like he's saying, these are your people. These are your people. Shouldn't they be in on this as well? Shouldn't this be something that's true of them? I want them to have this exposure. I want them to have this relationship with you. And so Moses is thinking beyond himself, but he's thinking of the community as well, which I think is really, really amazing. Now, when you get into verse 14, you have the response of God here, where he says in verse 14, he says, and he said, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. So Moses intercedes, and God says, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And listen, I believe that this is something that God was going to do all along, but I think God wanted to hear it from Moses, just like he wants to hear any sort of prayer. God has in mind for us things that he wants to do for us, but sometimes he won't move until we say something, because he wants to hear that from us. He wants to hear the cry of our heart. He wants to hear the emotion, the desires that we have about him, and lay it before him and say, God, this is what I want. Can you do this for me? And so God says, my presence will go with you. Okay, great. So God isn't going anywhere. He said, I'm not going to go among you. Now he says he is. In response to that intercession, he says, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. The giving you rest having to do with, again, them entering into the promised land and everything like that. And notice what Moses says here. You almost get the sense that ask the question, was Moses even listening here? He just kind of goes off, and he continues to speak again on this matter. And he says in verse 15, he says, and he said to him, if your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. Well, it's okay, Moses. He said that he will go with you. But again, I think what we're dealing with here is just somebody, and this is all drawn out, I believe, just by the close intimacy that has been developed in the relationship between Moses and God. This is just Moses being very expressive to God on where he is and where his heart is. Which, by the way, I think that's a very, very wonderful thing. It's a very good thing to do. One of the things that I'm a big advocate of is being honest before God. And that's what Moses was being right here. He was just being honest with God and just kind of showing him where his heart is. And so he says, look, if your presence doesn't go with us, then don't send us up from here. Okay? Now again, if you're not familiar with the context, if you're not familiar with the flow of the story, you might come upon something like that, and you might assume that Moses is saying, if you're not going to go with us, don't send us up from here, because it's going to be a lost cause. Because we can't do this without you. We need your strength. We need your guidance, et cetera, et cetera. We've already been through that, though. We already know that that's not the issue here. So in this case, what does Moses say here? After he says, if your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. He says in verse 16, he says, for how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? So there again, he includes the rest of the community in there, the community that he's just prayed for. Is it not in your going with us so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other nation on the face of the earth? So again, you get a sense of where Moses' heart is at. He says this is more than just this. This is more than just even just longing to have you in our midst, as good as that is. But what is this going to say about your fame among other people, and how we look among other people on the face of the earth, just as you go with us? In other words, he's saying is, if you're going with us and your presence is with us, that speaks a loud word to all the other surrounding nations. Which I think is a very wonderful thing for Moses to say, because if you read later in places like Deuteronomy chapter 4, one of the big things that happens as people live by the law and live by what God has laid out for them, you have these other nations who will say, man, this is a wise and understanding people. If you have a God who is with them and is in their midst all the time, that's one of the things that's going to draw their attention. And so you can see that even before you get to that point where we're talking about at Deuteronomy 4, we have Moses thinking on the same mindset of what God wants. And so this is going to be a testimony to all the people that we are a distinct people, that we are a different people. And that's really going to shed light on you. I think that's what Moses is thinking is in saying that as well. That as we come out and as your presence is with us and you're a distinct, and we are a distinct people because of your presence, that's going to shine a greater light on you among all the other nations. And so here you have a desire of Moses for an intimate relationship with himself, to continue with God. He wants the same thing for his people, but he also wants he also wants the Lord's fame through his people to be broadcast to the other surrounding people on the earth. And I think it's just really wonderful that Moses is a person who didn't have a problem with being different from everybody else. I think it's a challenge in our day and age. It seems like if we want God to show forth in our lives, we want it to be in a way where we look exactly the same as everybody else around us. We do the exact same things that everybody else does. We say the same things that everybody else does. We do jumping jacks in the same way that everybody else does. We drive, all these sorts of things. Everything has to be the same. And I think that we've lost sight of the fact is that there's something to be said about being a different people. Now, I understand that there are some things that we might do in a similar way to other people, just as a way of creating contact with other people. Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians 9, to a Jew I became a Jew, that I might win some to pagans and that sort of thing. But it seems like, and I don't know if you agree with me or not on this, but it seems to me that when it comes to the Christian community, when it comes to church, when it comes to anything about being different from everybody else around us, people are like, ooh, do we really want to be different? Do we want to do things in a different way? Do we want to act in a different way? Do we want to do this? Do we want to do that in a different way? I say, why not? We serve a holy God, and we are the people of God, of the church. Doesn't that by default make us a different people? And if we are walking in his ways, and if we're following his lead, there are going to be some things that make us different from everybody else, and I think that that's okay. Just think about, if you're thinking about even just with the Old Testament, you have here Moses saying, "Let us be a distinct people." You think about later on in Israel's history, what happened with Israel coming near the end of the time of the judges. They wanted a king to rule over them. Why? Because that's what all the other nations are doing. Never mind that God himself was their king. That was one of the big standout points among the, in the eyes of everybody else. But, the Israelites came to a point where they were saying, I think it would be good for us to have a king just like all the other nations do. And thus forfeiting this whole situation where God and God alone would be their king. Now, God still would be their king. God still rules over them. And even though they gave them a king, God said, make no mistake, I still rule. And the king has some rules that he needs to follow as well. But as far as appearance, as far as what's displayed for everybody else, would it have been harmful for the surrounding nations to see and understand that Israel was different in the sense that they didn't have a king? And in that case, being in a position to see that God himself, without any sort of human agency, as in a monarchy, was their king. That's huge. And yet you had people who were like, we need to be like the other nations. Because there's something to be said about being different, about being distinct. And that distinctness, that differentness, that holiness, that's just another way we can say it being holy. Holy is set apart. And being set apart, we are different from other people. There's something to be said about being different, about being holy. And in that holiness, people see that. They see the difference. And with some people, God will use that to draw other people to himself. And I think that's what Moses was after. That's what Moses was looking for. And so that's why he can say, if your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here, because it's with you going with us that shows that distinctiveness. And so it's not going, if you're not going to go with us, that whole thing is not going to be broadcast to the surrounding nations. And that's what Moses wanted. So when you get to verse 17, it says, "And the Lord said to Moses, this very thing that you have spoken, I will do. For you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name." And in verse 18, Moses said, "Please show me your glory." An interesting request, I would say. by Moses, you might get the sense, again, and again, this is if you're under the assumption that somebody's just coming at this at the first time and not really taking into account surrounding context, you might get the sense that Moses is asking this for the first time, or asking to see the Lord's glory for the first time. Lord, show me your glory. This is something I haven't seen before, but I want to see it now. Show me your glory. But if you're familiar with the story, if you're familiar with the outlay of Exodus, you know that Moses has seen glimpses of God's glory. At the very outset, at the burning bush, that was something else. And right there at the mountain, at Mount Sinai, you have a cloud of smoke that's covering the mountain. You have earthquakes and everything like that that's scaring the bejesus out of people. Does that chalk up to seeing the glory of God? Yeah, it does. So Moses here, so what do we make of this whole thing of Moses saying, please show me your glory? I think I heard somebody explain this really well not too long ago, but he kind of likened it, he kind of said it's a matter of where God shows somebody their glory, and then he gives them, as they continue to respond to that, he continues to give them a capacity and desire for more. So as they ask for more and God shows himself more, he says, I want more. And he shows them more. He says, I want more. And so there's this whole thing of God continuing to reveal himself as his people have this longing and desire to continue to see the glory of the Lord. Now, I think the glory of the Lord and having the glory revealed to you can kind of take two different forms, and especially as it relates to this text here in Exodus, and even in other parts of the Old Testament, because we think the glory of God, we think of his Shekinah glory, the light, the shining, and everything like that. And that is true. But the glory of God also encompasses his character, the manifestation of his character and who he is. And if you notice, we're not going to go into detail of this here. This is kind of part of the area that I was kind of dropping off, but I'll just mention it here in passing, where in verse 19, he says, and he said, I will make all of my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim before you my name, the Lord. That's more than just a glowing shining of light or anything like that. That's more, again, that's a revelation of who God is. Now, of course, as you read further in the story, what happens with Moses is that God says, I'll put you in the cleft of the rock. I'm going to pass by you. I'm going to put my hand over you. And I'm going to pass by you. And then when I lift my hand, you're going to see my back. And of course, all of those are anthropomorphisms because God doesn't have actual body parts. He's spirit. But it gives us a sense of God showing a little bit of who he is in that sense, giving him what he can handle. Because if he got the whole thing, he wouldn't be able to stand the input. And the whole thing of the understanding of what the Israelites thought and even what God says is you can't see it, look upon my face and live. But God does reveal himself, his glory, in a certain sense, and he lets his goodness pass by him. And so we can see a more of a glimpse of God and who he is. And so it's just amazing that you have Moses here. Just, I guess you can just chalk it up to him saying, I just want to see more. I want to see more. Have you ever seen God work in your life in an amazing way, or work in somebody else's life in an amazing way? And have you ever had, after that point, saying, or just thinking in your mind, I wouldn't mind seeing more of that. I wouldn't mind seeing that more and more down the road. And however way God wants to reveal himself and to reveal his glory, I would really love to see that. In some way, I think you can kind of make that parallel there. And so I think that's what Moses was after. And this all goes back again to the whole thing of the relationship and wanting it to continue and wanting to continue to be in his presence. If God's presence wasn't going to be with him, he wouldn't be able to see things like that. And that's what Moses wanted to see. So Moses is like, I just want more. I want more. Please show me your glory. There's one other observation that I want to make here. It's actually in chapter 34. Again, there's a lot of stuff that's missed, a lot of things that are left behind. But in the interim, I guess you could say that God has another meeting with Moses up on the mountain, renews the covenant with them, gives them a new set of tablets where God inscribes the law of God on there, the 10 Commandments. Because remember, Moses broke the first set because he came down from the mountain, saw all the brouhaha that was going on with the golden calf, and he threw it down and he broke them. So he got new tablets here. And when you look in chapter 34, you see just kind of the outlay of just what God is revealing about, about ceremonies and things like that. He's just he's renewing the covenant and just everything that's required of them and everything like that. So that's what you have going on there. Now, I just said before that one of the things that what we just seen is that Moses asked, "Please show me your glory." Now, before then, when he's talking about he's expressing his longing for God and expressing the longing of his presence. Remember, I said that this wasn't just a prayer for himself, but he wanted that for other people as well. You get a sense that Moses is totally into other people getting a glimpse of the glory of God as well. Even though that isn't something that he directly prayed for, you get that sense in the last part of chapter 34. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. And again, this all comes back to the other-centeredness that I mentioned before about Moses. So if you go, this is in the next chapter here, chapter 34, and starting in verse 29, it says, "When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, as he came down from the mountain, Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. Aaron and all the people of Israel saw Moses, and behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the leaders of the congregation returned to him, and Moses talked with them. Afterwards, all the people of Israel came near, and he commanded them all that the Lord had spoken with him in Mount Sinai. And when Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. Whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would remove the veil until he came out. And when he came out and told the people of Israel what he was commanded, the people of Israel would see the face of Moses, that the skin of Moses' face was shining. And Moses would put the veil over his face again until he went in to speak with him. Now, I mentioned before how I said that Moses is okay, and Moses is into this whole thing of other people getting a glimpse of God's glory as well. How did I come to that? Well, if you see there, as it says there, Moses came down from the mount, and he didn't realize that his face was aglow. It was like a shining light bulb, his face. And listen, this wasn't anything that, from the text or anything that God said that this is what I'm going to do. It's just something that happened. And again, when he came down, he didn't even realize that his face was aglow. And so when he comes down, Aaron and everybody else see that his face is shining brightly, and they're like, oh, and they start to back away, which I guess you get to the point where Moses realizes that there's something different, and realizes that his face is glowing after being in the presence of the Lord. That's the whole thing. It just didn't happen when he woke up in the middle of the night and his face was glowing. He had just come out of the presence of the Lord and his face was glowing. Now, I've heard some people teach on this before, and they'll say that because the people were afraid of the glow of Moses' face, then he put a veil over his face so that people wouldn't be afraid anymore. Well, that's not what the text said. The text said here, in verse 31, "But Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the leaders of the congregation returned to him, and Moses talked with them. Afterward, all the people of Israel came near, and he commanded them all that the Lord had spoken with him in Sinai." So Moses is saying all of these things, hasn't put on the veil yet. And then in verse 33, and when Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. Now, why in the world did he do that? Well, again, we don't have time to go into deep detail on this, but you get a sense of this in the words of Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, where Paul makes reference to this. And the one thing that he says is that Moses put the veil over his face so that they wouldn't see the outcome of that which was fading. So understand what's going on here. And this is all something by Moses' initiation. God's not saying, okay, this is when you're to put on the veil, this is when you're to take off the veil. This is what you're going to do here. And again, God didn't even tell Moses that when you leave my presence, your face is going to be aglow. Nothing like that is in the text. But you have a residual, I guess, if you want to use that word, of God's glory that's showing on Moses' face after he's been in his presence. And Moses speaks to them and then puts the veil over his face so that they don't see the fading of the glory that happens. Paul talks about the fading glory of this whole thing in comparison to the everlasting glory of the eternal covenant. That's how Paul starts to talk about it in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. But what you see here with Moses is that he understands that what he has on his face isn't going to last forever. And you get the sense that it gradually fades away. And so if he's covering his face after he's spoken to them and after they've seen the glow on his face, he's very concerned with them seeing the glory in its fullness, as long as it lasts there. And he doesn't want them to see the fading. And so, as it says there, as that text continued to say, when he'd go into the presence of the Lord, he would remove the veil. I take that to mean that as he's speaking to them, again, with whatever he talks with them about, as far as the glory goes, he's getting a little bit of a refill. So the glory goes out, and then he goes out, he talks to the people again, and then after he speaks to the people, he puts the veil on his face. Because what Moses is concerned about for the people, for the community, again, this is his other-centeredness that's working into this whole thing as well, is that he wants God and his glory to be displayed in its fullness. And he doesn't want them to see the fading sort of thing. Maybe he thought that if he saw it fading, that their desire, their fire would fade as well. I don't know. Can't get into the head of Moses as it relates to that. But you see that concern of having God's glory displayed in its fullness for the people of Israel, so that it would impact them as a community. So I would ask this, is that, well, actually, let me ask a couple of things, and I'm almost done here, but what's our glow like, I guess? Are we people, I guess I should say, who we find ourselves consistently in the presence of God so that a glow, not a physical, literal glow in our case, I would say, manifests itself to other people. Not just to people who are unchurched, not just to people who are on the outside, but people who are in the community, among ourselves. I think the one thing that we realize and that we understand is that the more that we spend time with somebody in their presence, we start to pick up their habits. We start to pick up their mannerisms sometimes. I know that I remember a while back, a friend of mine was working closely with our pastor at the church that I was going to there. He says, man, the more that I spend time with him, the more that I'm realizing that I'm starting to pick up his mannerisms. I start to talk like him, and I'm listening to him and go, yeah. That's kind of his trademark thing. As he's listening, he's like, yeah, and he's like, that's what I start to do when I'm listening to people. I cross my arms and I go, yeah, so I've spent enough time with him. I start to pick up on his habits, and it's one of those things where we start to emulate the person, the character of God. We see this in all parts of our lives. When I was a kid, I spent enough time with my dad in the mornings growing up, getting ready for school, watching him shave. He'd put on the shaving cream and shave his face and everything. And I started to do the same thing, not really with shaving cream and a razor, but I don't think my parents knew I did this, because if they did, they would have told me to stop. But I'd be brushing my teeth, and keep in mind, I'm a little kid. I'm not a teenager or anything. I'm a little kid. I'd brush my teeth. I'd spit out the toothpaste. Then I'd take the toothpaste, and I'd lather my face. And then I'd take my toothbrush, and I'd pretend like I'm shaving, like my dad does. Like I said, I don't think they knew that I did that. If they walked by and saw that I do that, they say, "Stephen, don't do that. That's not clean." But you get the idea, though. And so, like, what is our glow, and what is our glow, and do we even have a glow? Because we want to be in the presence of God. That's the question that I want us to mull over. And again, this is something that can impact all of us. That's something that I want for me to you as well. And this glow, quote unquote glow. I'm not saying that this is anything that I necessarily recognize in myself. Sometimes it's hard to really be able to pinpoint that in your own life. But I want to be a person who is in a position where the more I spend time with God, the more I grow to be more like him, the more he does work in my life, the more I look more like him, so that when I come before you, when I come before other brothers and sisters outside of this wall, and more that I come in contact with people in the world, people are able to see, and they might not be able to pinpoint it too, but they're able to see, I see something. There's a glow, again, to borrow the phrase, about him. That's the kind of example influence that I want to have for you, and I hope that you have that for one another. So it's not just a matter of just having a simply for ourselves, but it's something that we have for as a one another sort of thing as well. So what does it look like? Just as we come to a close here, what do our lives look like as it relates to this? What we've seen here. What is the true desire of our heart? Is our desire of our heart to continually be in the presence of God, to grow in that intimate knowledge of him, and to grow in that relationship, and to have that displayed and to glow out into other people? Not having it just for something for ourselves, but for something that impacts other people as well, both inside and outside the church. I think as we consider those things, as we continue to consider those things and mull over those things, and as we actually go before the Lord and pray to God and saying, this is what our desire is, I think that he meets us where we are. And I think that that's a prayer, that's a desire that honors him. Moses prayed those things, so you notice in two times explicitly, and maybe one time in an indirect way, God says, I'm going to honor that request. I'd say try him in that. I think that you'll see that he'll honor that request. So let's pray. Father, I pray that that would be the desire of our heart, the continuing desire of our hearts. I pray that as we continue to seek you, as we continue to abide in your presence, Lord, that we would be drawn ever more closer to you, that we would be able to see you, observe you, see you work in ourselves and in other people. And ultimately, Lord, what we want is for you to be glorified, for your fame to be known, just within the community of people here and to other places outside of the church walls, Lord. I just pray, Lord, that you would protect us from all the sorts of things that distract us, and from things that really at the end of the day, when it compares to the spiritual and the relationship with you, that they really don't matter. Help us to keep our minds, our hearts, and our desires focused on that which is primary and that which is truly important. And I pray that in all of that it would work to our transformation, our sanctification, both for ourselves and for other people as well. So what we want, Lord, is to see you at work. We want to see you move. We want to see you operate. And when that happens, may it result in praise, honor, and glory in your name. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.